All right, thank you for listening to this podcast. This episode of Literally is sponsored by Lexicon and Line. Case, tell us a little something about Lexicon and Line.
Lexicon and Line, it does three things. They are communications consultants. They teach professional business writing and speaking courses, and they are research and data evaluation experts.
And you can find everything about Lexicon and Line at lexicononline.com. Please give them a visit, and thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast, Lexicon and Line. Confronting authors with real questions about the writing process, the difficult and disheartening publishing industry, and why anyone would choose to torture themselves in the world of writing, this is the Literally Podcast with your host, writer, runner, and the literary voice of Ogden, Utah, Case Johnston. Exposing literature, the authors, the business, the process. The Literally Podcast.
This is Case Johnston. This is the Literally Podcast. We're podcasting today from the home of J.A. Carter-Winward, author, and thanks so much for having us, first off. Secondly, today J.A. Carter-Winward's going to read to us, and then we're going to discuss her two new forthcoming books. First, A Work in Progress, which is the title. So authors know that work in progress means WIP, work in progress, and we always say we always have a WIP or work in progress. The title of the book is Work in Progress. It's a book of poetry, dialogue poetry centered around God poems, and we can hear more about the background of that more later today. The second book is In Her Restlessness, a book of poems and prose, a hybrid genre book coming out later this year as well. So today we'll begin with the author sharing what she wants to share with us, and then we'll talk about that from there.
So I do some guest lecturing at Weber State for classes because they're teaching 2 or 3 of my short stories in fiction writing classes. So they like to have the local author come and talk to them. And I always get the same questions over and over again. Where do you get your ideas? And what do you do when you get writer's block? I don't, huh? And then, it goes from there. So I wrote a poem about that one question. It's what kinds of books do you write? What kinds of things do you write? And so the poem is called You Had to Ask. And it's a performance piece. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. You asked me what I write, and I said, I write the night. I shave out the insides of ancient urns and scrape in between damp cobblestones to find it. That place where the carpet's been rubbed raw, every hole a gradual gradient map of heels dug in or dragged chairs once trapped. I see that. Underneath your fingernails and right behind your ears, at the corners of your mouth, after you run from death and fear, I lurk there. And I gather up the dregs, spread them thin on my scope's slide, and I zoom. You like what's familiar, so you married a wife who looks like your sister. That's not conviction, that's cowardice, a creeping concoction of comfort. You swallow deep, it goes down the wrong hole. You puke up bile and call it your soul, wrapped in a piece of rotting meat and claim to be your greatest feat. I'm your worst nightmare, darling. The long tube I put in your ears to siphon out your secret fears. Your underbelly's showing. I roll it back, inhale the stench in brackish black. I slice your veins, your blood spills out the lies and truths you unknowingly spout. The poisonous secrets, your delicious dreams, your blackest terrors, your pleas and screams. I see between the off-white webs of the tall tale webs you weave. I hear the great collective thud of humanity's heart. I hear when it ceases and if or when it restarts. No one is out of my reach nor out of my sight. You have nowhere to run and you've nothing really to fight. You asked me what I write. And like I said, I write the night.
It's weird when you do like a performance piece and there's not a reaction, sort of. So it's typically that's how we roll when we're doing the podcasting.
I'm kind of used to that. After a while, the crowd usually is kind of silent for a minute, and they're like, "Shit, clappers, just kick our ass," like
Yeah, no, that's.
Well, we can always break form.
Yeah, yeah.
If you have laugh tracks, maybe use those wisely and sporadically throughout the cast. I think
That's a great idea.
Just
my question was just
inappropriate laugh track.
With a performance piece like this, and I love the background of it. Is what do you write about? Which is a question for writers. You're like, you just opened up the biggest can of worms that you could ever open up, because you don't even know what you're going to do that morning when you get up sometimes. My question is, with this one, we'll move to your next piece as we go along. Like I said, we can break form. Yeah. We don't have to get where is it within the writing of a piece like this that you decide when it's going to be a performance piece, like the one you just performed, or when it's just going to be just a poem where you get poet's voice and you go da 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 da, or does it happen before you even begin?
I absolutely know when it's going to be a performance piece, because I think the first thing that a writer needs to do is know who his or her audience is. If you don't know who your audience is, then you will not have an audience. So my audience is constantly in my mind. If I know that I'm going to be performing this piece, it doesn't matter what the crowd is or who the crowd is. What matters is I am performing it for a crowd. And so I need to bring things to life. And I don't just bring it to life, obviously, with the words. I bring it to life with how I speak the words. And I'm a musical person. So even my prose, I need to read it aloud so that when I'm reading it, it has a certain cadence and a certain rhythm to it. And there are times when I don't even mean to rhyme at all. As a matter of fact, I tend to try not to rhyme. But on occasion, it just happens because that natural rhythm just happens. It just comes and it comes and it comes. So it depends. There are some poems I've written that can be read aloud, but they're absolutely meant to be also enjoyed on the page. Something like this is good on the page, but I did a performance piece not recently, but last year, for a YouTube video, and it's absolutely a performance piece because it was not even a performance. It was real. It was absolutely real. Mm-hmm. But on the page, it does not do it justice, obviously. So yeah, I absolutely have to have my audience in mind before I start anything.
What does that change during the process?
It depends on who I want to be in the moment and what I'm trying to say and what I want to accomplish with a poem. So if what I want to accomplish is I want people to understand who I am or what I'm about, then usually it's something that gives them a facet of me, because we really don't, especially as writers, I think a lot of writers, I know this from personal experience and from a lot of friends, that they will write something, and when it works, they have to keep writing what works. Writing is a business. It's not just an art form. It's also a craft, and it's also a business, and it's also a profession. Mm-hmm. And I think it just depends on what you want to do with that. So I have a friend who wrote an incredibly great YA novel, and it won some awards, and it was very much literary fiction, YA literary fiction. But he found that he could do part-time on his job he hated and write full-time if he did genre YA fiction, and so that's what he chose to do. And that's simply a personal choice. There's nothing wrong with that. I just happen to have the luxury of being able to write what I really want to write. So
yeah, it is business, not an easy business.
Yeah, but at the same time too, it's also we're also entertainers. Let's not fool ourselves. I mean, I think we
hope so, right?
Well, right.
Yeah.
We like to be lofty and say, well, we're artists, and well, yeah, we are. But if you write something that is completely inaccessible and unreadable, you might get the tittering claps of a few gray-faced people. Is that what you want? If that's what you're looking for and that's what you want to accomplish, then great, that's great. But if you want to be read, then you write what it is that not necessarily for the audience, but the underlying motivation for me mostly is I think that connection that you get. And I have a poem I wrote about that actually in Work in Progress, the book that's coming out that talks about when I first began to read, and my mom didn't know I could. So there were books she definitely did not want me reading. I'm absolutely certain of it, including, East of Eden. I was way too young for that, but it was fascinating to me, and I fell in love, and I suddenly didn't feel so alone. And I think that was kind of that pivotal point for me, where it's like I realized that when you read an author with whom you connect, you are in their skins, and suddenly you aren't alone anymore. You are literally breathing the air they breathe. You're the blood that pumps through them pumps through you. It's an exceedingly intimate experience, no matter what they're writing. It doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction. It doesn't matter. But I don't personally believe there's anything as nonfiction. People say, well, what about, memoirs? Talk about the most unreliable narrator on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sorry, Humbert is not the most unreliable narrator. Sorry. Memoirs are. Because through their subjective experience, they have a narrative that they have given themselves to give their story this narrative arc. That paints them in a certain way. And smart memoirists will always make sure that they have a little bit of smudges on the cape they wear.
Some self-deprecation.
Absolutely.
Yep.
There has to be some of that. Any good writer knows that you can't have a perfect protagonist. I'm currently working on a memoir right now, and I bet any family members listening to this right now probably all just completely wet themselves.
They just shut you off.
They're like, turn that off right now. Pray, sing a
It's
hymn.
all fiction.
Sing a hymn now. Everyone on their knees now.
Well, and I think there's part of it too is not only the shaping for memoirs, why it's unreliable for story's sake, but also because why they're, like you said, just playing off that they're the most unreliable narrator is because we have to survive. It's a survival tactic too, that we were making it through our lives. And we have to do it in a way that we can live with ourselves, and I think everybody does that like you live with the past that you have and you shape it in a way that you can live today and you can live tomorrow. And I think that's part of the memoirist problem too, as an unreliable narrator, is that part of that storytelling is dealing with their own way of surviving day to day and shaping it so that they can swallow it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think so too.
And
I think
big part of it. Yeah.
It's huge. And I think the interesting thing is that we all have that narrative. And it's interesting. I mean, for example, if you've ever talked to somebody who's been through a divorce, and if you know both parties, okay, you talk to one of them and they say, oh, let me tell you about what an asshole he was or what a bitch she was, and they go on and then he destroyed our marriage, and she's bipolar on top of it, because isn't everybody's ex bipolar? So, and then you talk to the other spouse, they're like, yeah, mistakes were made, both sides, man. I'm telling you, I was not perfect. I had a lot of stuff I did wrong, and if I could do it over, I would, but I can't. So, and then you look at that and you go, which one is the most reliable narrator, do you think, out of those two stories? And the person that owns the most of responsibility in what went wrong, as well as what went right. What went right, that's really important when you're talking about a divorce situation, to have somebody say, these are things that went right. That right there is an absolute acceptance of truths that incorporate a failure. Nobody wants to remember their failures, but the interesting part about those failures is that failure with a lot of people carry a lot of shame. And the way to transform that shame through art is by making it into something you're proud of. And I don't mean necessarily bad behavior. You're not going to write something about bad behavior and say, and I'm proud of the fact that I, shaved this guy's head in his sleep. It was, but it's about writing about that experience and giving it a redemption within the artistic form, whatever that is. So my memoir is not actually going to be linear at all, because memories don't come in a linear way. We don't remember start to finish. It goes this way. I mean, if you want to tell a story, sure. But again, you're looking at an unreliable narrator, and the only thing that you can do about your past is change the narrative of it. And how you choose to transform and change that narrative, and how much responsibility you want to take, and how much responsibility you need to give, because some people take way too much responsibility and some people don't take enough.
And yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about the smarter memoirists are good at least saying, I messed up here. And here I am able to say, I know that I did, and I may not even see it right. The smarter ones are able to do it.
Absolutely.
Some of them, they just want to look perfect, right?
Oh, yeah,
and they're real. They're the realist.
Right. They're realist. And also, or else the memoirists who come out with the whole, I was victimized by this and that and whatever. And the entire crux of the memoir is about, quote, surviving. And I'm not saying in how you said surviving. I'm talking about surviving really awful, awful things maybe. And writing about those things and then coming out like, look how strong and how brave I am because I did this. I woke up every day and I kept going. Mm-hmm. And I'm a person who I've always looked at the contraries. I've always looked at the other side of things. I always get into other people's heads and the empathy piece of that. So when people come at me with that kind of thing, it's like, I survived this kind of thing. I've had the hardest time in this and that and whatever. I kind of look and say, if I ever think that way, I think to myself, God, who had it worse than me? Mm-hmm. And if you go and look through history, if you look through the world, you can always find a sadder story. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what are you trying to accomplish with your memoir? If you are painting yourself as this survivor, I survived this, I survived that, my feeling is, okay, but do you have a compelling story? And why is it different than any other survivalist story who suffered XYZ of childhood or whatever it is? So.
Yeah. We got there from just asking about the craft of a performance piece. So let's go to the next one. What's your next poem?
Next poem. Oh, geez, I don't know.
I like breaking form. This is great. That was a great conversation. We can do that anytime we want to. Okay.
Well, actually, here's one. Here's one I think I'm just gonna do like on the fly a little bit. I think because I wasn't planning on doing it, but it talks about the memoir stuff. So a lot of people find or talk a lot about their past or their pastors or traumas, the trauma poems, and you get them a lot at the open mics and the whatevers, and then you get this these extremely vivid details about horrific things that happen to people, and I understand that that's something that they need to process and they need to do. I think too, though, there are times when something needs to be a differentiation between a journal entry and something you perform for an audience. There are certain things. I mean, I can't bleach my brain when I'm done, so I will listen to things like that sometimes, and I'm just kind of like, I kind of feel violated along with you. I didn't want to come here and get violated by that story, and I feel violated because I didn't want to hear it. What I wanted to hear was a representation of that and how that was redeemed. And there's some things that aren't redeemable, I get it, but maybe those are some things that can be taken on a different tack, so that nuance, there's all kinds of things.
Telling of something is not what you were looking for.
Right. So this poem actually kind of says it all, I think, in a lot of ways. So I'm just going to go ahead and go with it.
Yeah.
And again, my poetry styles change. So for the performance, there's more lyricism. I do write lyrical pieces that are very uplifting-ish and whatever-ish. And then I write kind of the Bukowski style, balls to the wall. No lyricism, no pretty metaphors. And so this one is one of those kinds. So it's called Amends. My therapist asked me why I wasn't angry. I told him I can't be angry at dead people. My parents are dead. What harm can they do? What harm did they do? He stated, not asked. Then I thought about getting angry, but I can't be angry at dead people. There's no way they can say I'm sorry, and there's no way I can say, me too.
So with that poem, it really does delve into what we were talking about, the nuance.
Yes. It's actually more of what is not said.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people don't pay very close attention to that when for example, the I'm a visual artist as well, so
Right.
I paint. So I mean, the paintings in this room, they're all mine. A lot of times people they look at the focal point of the painting, but just as important is the contrast, the negative space, the space that doesn't have the visual excitement. But without one, there can't be the other, which is why contraries fascinate me. That constant contrary. When somebody says something, or something is a given, an axiom, or an accepted concept, I like to look at the words. I like to see them, and I like to turn them around and study them and look at them. And I like to see what's behind the words, and I like to read what's between lines, and I'll read something that somebody will write. And this girl said, what an amazing summary of my haiku. This is I'm not kidding. A summary of my haiku. It was like I did 3 paragraphs about her haiku.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, sweetheart, you did the summary. You did the amazing, beautiful haiku.
Yeah.
I deconstructed it
Filled in all
this
those
way
extra,
because every word you used, there's a reason you use the words you used. You use them because they are part of your vocabulary. Your vocabulary was cultivated by your experiences, by what you read, by how you live, by what you think, by what you watch, what you experience. And so because you used that particular word, that one word is a million words.
Mm-hmm. And that's why poets are so great, and that's why I'm not a poet. I just wrote a whole essay about breezes and how my family has been into breezes since I was little. We used to.
So how do you feel about Febreze?
Febreze, love it.
Love Febreze.
Love
so,
Febreze.
So you are open to sort of like alternative breezes.
Alternative breezes.
I'm aroused
Except
right
for
now. I'm
quiet,
aroused.
except for quiet breezes that my brother and I named, the silent but deadly.
I see.
Flatulations,
okay,
quiet
you know
breezes
what?
when we were
the
little.
best way to get through that is you just simply pretend it's your own.
That's true. Yeah. Quiet breezes. I
I had 4 brothers, so I am completely potty mouth disgusting when it
breezes,
comes
yeah.
to potty humor. I'm helpless with it. I'm just helpless. I will crumble to tears. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I love Utah in the fall. I can't. It seems like. You see that transition?
I saw it. That was a bumpy segue, but let's ride it. Let's ride it on out, Brandon. Woo!
Well, that's the thing is, I've always gotten in trouble for
funny.
my discussion of flatulence my entire life, and if my mom listened to this, she's like, "There he is again. There he is again."
Quiet
Yeah.
breezes.
It always gets the laugh, though.
It does.
Okay,
It
so-
does.
Yeah, well, I want to do a dictionary of ennui, a whole dictionary, and that would be called like innuendo ennui.
Yes.
It's the ennui that men feel in the workplace when a slightly attractive coworker says just a softball that you just want to make into a sex joke, but you just can't.
You don't do
and
it.
So there's that slight sadness that time is gone where you cannot make sexual innuendo at work, and it's innuendo ennui.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
No longer.
I've got unicorn ennui. It's when you first try your very first psilocybin mushroom and you don't see a unicorn running across the street, but your friend does, and you have that sense of ennui that you didn't see the unicorn. And you look for the little jelly bean poopies in the street. They're not there.
They're not.
And you feel the sense of ennui.
I once saw, this is a totally different story, and I have a question for this exact poem. It was a totally different story, but I once, when I was on mushrooms, Mom, please turn away.
Turn this one down.
There were no unicorns, but this is this was a bad night. I was going to Del Taco,
It's it was a bad night.
like 1 a.m. I was not driving, and we saw a guy in his car run into a telephone pole, fly out the front of his car.
Oh, this
and,
car.
and we were all we were all tripping really hard, and that's like that changed. Let's just say that changed the evening, But it's one of those things that every once in a while I'll see it. Anyways, back to this poem. Where you talk about it was the creepiest thing in the entire world to see a guy go through the window when you're on mushrooms.
Really?
Yeah.
Because it really happened.
It really happened.
It really happened.
It really happened.
Yeah.
And the guy-
I bet I can top creepy, and there wasn't even mushrooms involved. I bet because I was in a Wendy's drive-through, and I looked right down below the little ledge, and I saw a guy doing something very different with a pole in his car.
Yes.
And
why is it always the fast food restaurant?
Why is it always? Yeah.
The car in back of me honked. It was like, he's not done. Hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on.
This never happens. We're not. It never happens when you're like, oh, we were having a glass of wine and we went out to a nice restaurant.
Right.
It's like
no matter where.
One night when I went to Wendy's or Del Taco.
My husband just handed me a poem about my experience with mushrooms. Thanks, sweetie.
We can do that one. Thanks, Ted.
I don't necessarily want to.
Okay, we don't have to. But I do have a question about this poem.
Which one?
The most recent one.
The amends? Right?
Yes.
Amends? Okay. Thanks, honey, though.
I can't be angry at dead people. That's a really...
Yeah, you had me there.
Yeah, me too, immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Because we do. We get angry at dead people. We do.
Well, it depends on how long they've been gone.
Yeah.
At first... I think it depends on how they go. So, I had an extremely complicated relationship with my parents, specifically my mom. And my family, my dad was Satan, my mother was the angel. There was a very black and white thing there because he was awful, she wasn't. And the thing is that I just really I saw that they were both incredibly beautiful, but also very, very troubled, broken people in so many ways, and yet so beautiful also. And my dad was this incredibly complex, beautiful, wounded man, and I had a soft spot for him. I was the only kid of his really that he got along with a whole lot because all of my brothers just really, they didn't like him, and they didn't spend a lot of time with him. It was just tough. So, but my dad and I had a really interesting, really awesome relationship. And if you should find that poem, honey. Oh, maybe not. I don't know what words are acceptable in this, or not.
All words are acceptable.
All words are acceptable. Do you remember the one about my 18th birthday? Anyway, it's in...
I like that he's just on the phone.
I know. Good job, Kent.
Yeah. You have an assistant. It's pretty great. Yeah.
Yeah. Who's the guy that looks up all the stuff for the somebody? Who is that? Like with, I don't know, Howard Stern?
I don't know.
I
want
There's always a fact checker.
The fact checker. Yeah. Can we get that side? There we go. It's right.
I know they do that on ESPN. Like, can you get those stats?
Stats Inc. or whoever. Different production companies have different names for the people in the back who essentially look all the stuff up. Yeah.
Yeah. This poem is actually... I don't know if I can actually...
Gotta do it.
All right. Yeah, I actually heard from the person that this poem, it features a few people I knew. And one of them was high school. She wrote me this really nasty gram after the book came out and was really, really angry at me about this poem. And I told her, well, if you didn't want me to write about it, maybe you shouldn't have done it. So, and that's kind of how I feel. I mean, the books are called No Apologies, No Secrets, No Regrets. And my feeling is, if you don't want to have to apologize and you then don't do anything for which you will have to apologize and don't have any secrets, and then you won't have any regrets. And that's kind of, don't do anything you regret. I mean, that's kind of a messy way of saying it. But anyway, this is called Peaches. I was dressed like a hippie in my tie-dye shirt and Levi's, but everyone else had safety pins and shit in their faces. Billy Rat had a blue mohawk, and he was slamming in the middle of the room with two other guys. One was named TJ. There was a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and Black Flag was playing really loud, and I just tried to not get hit by flailing limbs. My friend, Jennifer, had sort of a mohawk, but it stopped just on the top of her head, and it was at least a foot tall. People nicknamed her Peaches because she let TJ stick some canned peaches in her cunt and eat them out. We walked to the Indian Cultural Center and saw the Descendants play in concert, but I left early to lie on the grass because I was sick. It was cold because it was November, and some guy in a VW asked me if I needed a ride home. He drove me all the way back to the suburbs and dropped me off at my house. I can't believe I lucked out and didn't get some rapist. I walked in and it was late, and my dad saw me, but I ran to the bathroom to puke. When I came out, he had made me chicken noodle soup. I remember he said happy birthday to me because it was my birthday and I was 18. He pretended not to smell the smell of cigarettes and puke.
That's a poem about you and your dad. It's not about peaches.
It is not.
It's not about peaches at all.
It is not.
No.
Peaches is a detail to get us to that moment, to give us everything else we need about you at that time.
Yeah.
I love that. I really love that
Interestingly, there's a funny story about that. Do you know the writer Brian Evenson?
Mm-hmm.
The BYU guy,
Yeah.
and then he writes all this crazy. I've got a signed book of his right back there. He sat in this office with me, and we were chatting about work in progress, actually. And I told he said, so he lived in Orem in the 80s around that time, and he goes, "You went to the Descendants? What year was it?" And I told him, and he was like, "Oh my God, I was there." I'm like, "Are you shitting me?"
Yeah.
So we were geeking out on punk for like the next hour as we like talked and drove around Ogden because he was here for a conference thing.
That was my question. Was the Descendants came to Utah?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And Orem?
No. Indian Culture Center down Salt Lake City.
Okay, yeah.
So we were there, and we were like, all in this basement because I spent most of my time in this just nasty basement apartment on like 4th South. But then we walked to the Indian Culture Center. Yeah, I laid on the grass, and I was just like, And then this guy in the BMW, he was like, "Do you need a ride home?" I was like, It was my 18th birthday, and I came home, and my very LDS dad, not very LDS, just LDS dad, standing at the top of the stairs. It was like, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. The guy did not even boil water, and he made me chicken noodle soup, Lipton's, not Campbell's, Lipton's.
Top shelf.
That's right. And I remember we just sat across from each other, and he's like, "Are you feeling better?" And I was like looking at him, and I remember thinking right at that moment, "I'm so glad I'm home." And it was so funny because I spent my entire childhood and adolescence trying to get as far away from home as I could.
Yeah.
And so that one moment, I was just glad to be there with him.
And that poem does all that.
Yeah.
And those little and the poem wouldn't be the same without the peaches. Do you know what I mean? And I'm saying that in just strictly a craft analysis of that poem, it wouldn't, because without going there, you couldn't get to the place where you and your dad at the end. Couldn't do it.
Right.
I mean, you might have done it differently, but it'd be a different poem.
Right.
So.
That's the thing, is that it's people don't understand how important words are and the details that go into every word. And I had somebody, he's kind of a burgeoning writer, and he said to me that he's reading this book written by a famous author who, damns the adverb. And then there's also the damn quote from Samuel Clemens, the beloved Mark Twain, said, "Every time you write the word very, replace damn, and then the editor will cut it, and then you'll have a good book." And so I did a post where I tried to use very and damn in every other word to point out the fact that I don't trust anybody who says they are a writer who hates any word.
Yeah.
I don't hate any words.
Or any words are off limits.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Because it depends how you use the word.
Yeah, absolutely.
In 2018, political correctness is on the upswing, maybe we can say. And so this is fascinating to me to listen to this because I feel like many maybe new writers would self-edit because they're worried about this doesn't fit the narrative currently. How do you not do that? How do you use those words then?
You do it, and then you get the blowback, and then you do it, and you keep doing it. What's difficult about that, especially, is I can take on somebody who's a right-wing conservative religious person, and they can come out with me with everything they've got, and they can say, "And how dare you say that you're an atheist?" Actually, I'm not an atheist. I'm a dubious. And they're, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, I'm dubious that there's a God, but if there is one, cool, whatever. If there isn't, well, fine, whatever. I am okay with not knowing." So you're agnostic. No, I think that's really a pussy thing to say. Like, seriously, I don't really know, but just in case, I'm going to believe it, but maybe not. No, it's like I'm a dubious. I'm dubious that there is a God. But if there is one, I would like to, maybe have a chat with him, and let's start with Somalia and work down, which is, of course, the whole, theodicy argument. But back to PC. A lot of women don't like my novels, my writing, my books. And I told you about the, I write like a man kind of thing. I have read a lot of male writers, literary writers, who write about male sexuality. And I find it interesting because they are called misogynists. They, with the way they write women, like Philip Roth, for example. Women hated so many of his books because it was, surrounding the almighty dick or whatever. But a lot of my stories, especially my male characters, it surrounds male sexuality and the male psychosexual process. And my editor, she's in New York, and she actually edited Erica Jong, the author of Learning to Fly, which was a seminal work in feminist sexual fiction back in the 60s, in the late 60s. But she said the fact that you have this into the male sexual psyche is incredible to me. How did you do that? And it's because I'm a humanist. I don't call myself a feminist. I can take on the God Bible wielding thumping, but when people come at me who are really of my same sort of, I'm a very liberal, socially liberal person. But there are certain things that I can't abide. I can't abide hypocrisy. I can't abide the fact that people know what misogyny is, but when you ask them about misandry, they ask if it's about something to do with animals. No, it is not. It means the hatred of men. And that's something that's not talked about. And if you get anybody, any male at all saying, hey, we can't paint all men with the same broad brush. We're not all rapists and pedophiles. And then their careers get ruined. That to me is obscene. I don't identify with that kind of hatred. So I get a lot of blowback for a lot of the stuff I write. Yeah. Because I write, for instance, in in my book, Grind, that novel, there's a character in it that women are all set to hate because he represents everything women hate when it comes to that power male, the money, the looks, the everything, using women, blah, 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 blah. And then I absolutely yank out that rug, and I make him absolutely empathetic, sympathetic. I make him not only sympathetic, but there's no way you can read it and not just go, oh, Jesus. And usually by that time, women close the book. I hate the book. I hate the character. I hate it. Because they need that narrative of, male sexuality is dangerous. It's ugly. They're pigs. It's awful, et cetera, et cetera. And I just do not feel that way.
They didn't want that flip.
No, they did not.
Yeah, they didn't want to stomach it.
So when I do the classes, like I have something I say to all the classes whenever I teach them. They say, well, what's the most important thing is, to be a good writer? And they read writers that you like, or read good books, or good, or write every single day. I'm like, oh, please don't do that. If you don't feel like writing, don't write. I said the most important thing, if you want to be a great writer, you must cultivate empathy and compassion. Mm-hmm. If you don't, you will not only fail as a writer, you will quite certainly fail as a human being. And so I talk to them about empathy and compassion. I take my research very seriously. So for one of my books, I went to LA and met with adult film star Nina Hartley. And she and I hung out in her condo, and we talked about the adult film industry. And that's how I got the background for TDTM. Grind, I went to Portland, and I spent all day long with a nude dancer, and then I spent the entire evening at her club. And I was there with my notebook and my purse and my beer, and I'm this older woman, and there's all these beautiful young bodies naked. They're all nude. And this guy staggers over to me, and he was like kind of hitting on me a little bit, so I'm thinking beer goggles times 12. And I said to him, the flesh is right up there.
Have you seen the stage?
And then so he says to me, so what's the notebook for? And I said, I'm writing a book. I'm doing research. What's the book about? And I'm not going to give him the entire premise. Yeah. Even though it's an elevator pitch of 30 seconds, I could tell it was a 2-second thing or nothing. Mm-hmm. I said, the book's about power. And he goes, oh, so like about how men subjugate women and how we like objectify them. And I said,
that's quite the client at a strip club.
I looked at him and I said, I pointed to the stage, and it was littered with bills and money. And I said, look, and I pointed to all the men around the stage, and I said, look at that. I said, do you really think you're the one with the power in this room? And he just went, And kind of all the air got sucked out of him. And it was the most interesting experience for me. I've been to strip clubs where they have the pasties and G-strings. There, men act like frat boys. Yeah, they scream and they yell, hey honey, hey baby. Nude strip club is different. Nude strip clubs are different. It was like being in a church. I sat next to this man who had a whole bunch of friends next to him, and then this woman came out, and she was older. You could tell she'd had kids. She had long hair. She laid down on the floor. I was watching her. She was just this goddess, and every single man there was worshiping her, and there was silence. There was no catcalls. There was no lewd comments. They were treated with the utmost respect, and it fascinated me. And so I'm sitting there next to him. I'd never even spoken to this guy. I'm just sitting there writing, and she was right in front of us. And he couldn't say this to his friend next to him. He leaned to me, and he leaned over, not taking his eyes off of her, and he said, "Oh my God, will you just look at that? She's so beautiful." It was reverence. And that's what women just don't understand. I think the pasties and the G-string, it is another way of saying you can't have it. You don't get it. And we have the power. And a lot of women will reject that because men actually have had lots of power in the sexual realm for a long time, and they've used it badly. And I get why women are angry. But I'm not talking out of my ass here. I'm not somebody who's never had issues with male violence, sexual or otherwise. But you cannot paint all men with the same brush. So my books they do treat male sexuality with compassion. So as I'm talking to these students about empathy and compassion, I'm writing a book of short stories called Cherry Pop. It's about stream of consciousness in 300 words or less when a person loses their virginity. So you're hearing all their thoughts as it's going on. And I said, there is a story where this young man loses his virginity to rape. And everyone went, "Oh." And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "He was only 14. And they were like, "Oh, oh." And I said, "Yes." And I said, and it's very easy to feel that compassion and empathy, isn't it? Because how horrifying. And they said, "Yeah, it's terrible. That's awful. It's terrible." And I said, "Now, I should tell you what the story's about. You see, he lives in a country where women are not allowed to wear Western clothing. And so he and his older cousin and several other relatives took a woman off the street who was in Western clothing, and they gang raped her. And that is how he lost his virginity. Now where is your compassion and empathy?" And everyone just went, "Oh, shit." I like to challenge that. I like to push that boundary, because the only way that we can actually grow as human beings is to actually find compassion in the places that we absolutely find repugnant. And we have to do that, because if we don't do that and we continue living in these echo chambers that tell us only what we want to hear, how in the world are we going to evolve at all as human beings? And I think that's what writing is about for me, is pushing those boundaries all the time.
And have somebody who can write it.
Right. And a man cannot get away with writing the kind of stuff I do. They can't. But I can get away with it. And my latest novel is about a man who goes to a brothel for the first time in his life, and what happens within him there throughout that. So, but Work in Progress has a lot of, No Regrets has a lot of that. Work in Progress has that. Work in Progress is actually, you were asking about like how did my environment impact me with the writing. I actually invent my own religion in Work in Progress. Really, it's kind of like I explain everything from what happens after you die to why it explains homosexuality. It explains everything from for the atonement, Jesus and the history and how the world was created, and who gets to be immortal. Anybody who is remembered on Earth is immortal, which means that whenever human energy goes toward remembering somebody, they get to be immortal until the last person who remembered is forgotten, and then they're gone. So yeah, Hitler's up in heaven, but a sweet granny from 1712 isn't. And that's and the God of my book is very capricious and very very human. And so the God poems are this constant kind of narrative. This him having conversations with everybody from Elvis to Christopher Hitchens to Epicurus to Adam and Eve. I mean, you name it. I was right in the middle of recording that book for audio when my sound engineer, he hadn't seen me for 6 months because I'd gotten very ill. I wrote him and said, I am ill and I need to come perform a poem there because I don't know how long I'm going to be able to speak, because I was losing my ability to speak. Within 2 weeks, I lost my ability to speak and walk. I went there to their house, to where the studio is. It's called Onion Street Studios. It's in West Bountiful, and they are fantastic. And my friend Kurt Cochran met us at the door. He was the first person I had let see me when I started moving and shaking. The first person I would allow to see me because I was horrified. And I recorded that poem there. And again, we weren't working, we were halfway through work in progress. He was the first one to see me, and I'd seen people before. I'd gone out in public, like my daughter's graduation. I saw friends out in public who saw me, and here I was shaking like a rag doll in a wind tunnel. And they would go, oh, hi, are you? See you, bye-bye. And they'd run away. Like, I have no idea what to do with you. I mean, these are grown adults who can't stop and say, Jesus Christ, what's happened to you? Mm-hmm. I mean, what the fuck is wrong with that? How hard is that? Seriously. And I get that it's awkward. But how come it is? So I walk up and he sees me and his eyes just fill with tears and he just held on to me. And we needed it done because he and Melissa were going to London for their anniversary, to Europe for their anniversary, 25 years. And so we did the run of the poem in the studio because I had to lip sync it for the filming. And Kurt worked on that poem day and night to make sure it was perfect for the filming. And it was the last project he worked on before he was killed by a terrorist in London. I was the only author he'd actually worked with. He usually worked with musicians. Losing Kurt, he was like a brother who wasn't mean to me. That's who Kurt was. And I shared every God poem with him because he was a fellow atheist, so to speak, a former LDS person who was ejected. And he loved the God poems so much. And so I shared one with him called Final Destination, about what happens after you die. And that was his favorite poem, which was so odd. But the very last book we worked on together was No Regrets. It was the last one we completed. And he helped, we did the music together. We created original music for it. And he did a surprise thing for me, and I wanted to share it with you. It's not very long. It's like 22 seconds, if that. This is the very end of No Regrets. And again, he did this kind of as a surprise. Now, I don't know if you know about how he got killed, but he got hit by a car. The terrorist drove a car into a crowd of people on the bridge. He threw himself in front of as many people as he could to save them, and he did. And he was knocked off of the bridge. Had he hit the water, he would have lived. He hit the cement, and he died. But this is the very end credits of No Regrets, my last poetry book that he and I worked on, and I want you to hear it because his voice is on it. You have just heard No Regrets, written by J.A. Carter-Winward, read by J.A. Carter-Winward.
I regret nothing.
Perfect way to wrap up. I regret nothing. This is Case Johnston. This is the Literally Podcast. Today we are podcasting from J.A. Carter-Winward's home in Ogden, and I just want to say thank you for everything you've given us today.
No, thank you for being here, and it was really wonderful to have you here and talk with you.
Yeah, I hope that hope we could do it again. I hope we do it again.
I hope we do. We have a lot to talk about.
We could have talked for another. I got to one question, and that's perfect.
Probably my fault too, huh?
That's absolutely perfect. But again, I just want to say thank you for sharing so much with us today. It was real, it was honest, and that's what we want to hear. That's what we want to listen to. Those are the people that we want to talk to on the Literary Podcast. So thank you again.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you for listening to this podcast. This episode of Literally is sponsored by Lexicon and Line. Case, tell us a little something about Lexicon and Line.
Lexicon and Line, it does three things. They are communications consultants. They teach professional business writing and speaking courses, and they are research and data evaluation experts.
And you can find everything about Lexicon and Line at lexicononline.com. Please give them a visit, and thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast, Lexicon and Line.